Good morning. I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us here this morning. Make sure you can see me. I'm a little short in the back there. I want to thank Mine Corps and ILST very much for giving us the funding so that we can go forward with our program today. I want to thank them for their support. I also want to thank our team of interpreters who worked very hard to prepare. And I want to thank our guests for traveling. Some took a train, some had to get on a plane to join us here today. I want to share some information about why we've decided to work together this morning. There are three groups of us who are all working on documentation of ASL and analyzing the features of ASL. And we've been trying to develop a corpus of ASL. However, we've been working in three separate areas of work and have not had the opportunity to come together. So now we finally do have that opportunity, and we are doing today. So with that opportunity, that leads us also to a chance to show you some of the work that we've been focused on. And so this morning, we are going to be presenting our work to you. Make sure you can see me in the back, but I did want to give you a little information about today's event, the schedule, and what you can expect. We're going to begin with two presentations this morning. We're going to begin with Emily Shaw. I'll give you a little background information, a bio on each of our presenters this morning. And when we begin the presentations, they will come up to the front of the room. I'll begin with Emily Shaw. She's in the Faculty Department of Interpretation at Gallaudet University and Transliteration. She's been there since 2015. She received her PhD in Linguistics at Georgetown University. She analyzes discourse from spoken English and ASL. She has also done research in LSF as well. She has authored a book, The Historical and Etymological Dictionaries of ASL. And now in her current work, she teaches and advises graduate students in the Masters of Interpreting program. Her presentation today is going to be on Gallaudet University's documentation of ASL called GUDA. After that, I will be presenting, along with Meredith, we will be presenting the preliminary observations on dominance reversal in Philadelphia ASL. After that second presentation, we'll take a coffee break. We'll see how that goes. And then we will have two more presentations. We will have Dr. Joseph Hill and Dr. Corinne Aquino. I'll begin with Dr. Hill. He is the assistant professor in the Department of ASL and Interpreter Education at NTID at RIT. He received his PhD in Linguistics from Gallaudet University. And he focuses on linguistic aspects of African American varieties of ASL and his beliefs related to signing varieties in the American deaf communities. He's also the lab director of the Deaf Studies Laboratory at NTID Center on Cognition and Language. I will move on to Dr. Corinne Aquino. She also is a research faculty at NTID and RIT. She has a PhD in linguistics from the University of New Mexico, and her research interests include exploring how the use of language impacts organizations and the structures of language. She looks at multimodal spoken languages and sign languages to better understand how the visual modalities impact the structure of these systems. She is also working in the documentation of linguistics variations in ASL, including the DIVA project that she and Joseph will talk about today. And then finally, we will have Dr. Julie Hoaxang. She's the assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at Gallaudet University. Her PhD is in linguistics from Gallaudet. She's interested in sign language documentation, and her field of interest is in phonology and phonetics of sign languages, language documentation. She's done fieldwork, transcription, and corpus linguistics of sign languages. She is keenly interested in making ASL collections accessible to deaf communities. And her presentation today will be on ASL Signbank. Now, after all of those presentations are done, we will all have an opportunity to have pizza and a chance to meet and greet. Okay, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to bring on Emily Shaw. Thank you so much.
Okay, can everybody see this? And you can all see me, you need to see me. Good morning. I am thrilled to be here. I'm so happy to be invited. Thank you so much, Jamie, for organizing this. It's my pleasure to have this opportunity to have this discussion among colleagues. And I think that as you described each of us in our silos, I think, oh, we're really, is the lighting okay for the people who need that now that we've changed the lighting? I'm sorry.
Will you switch that lighting when you switch? Okay.
Really, each of us are passionate about the work that we do, so to come together will strengthen us, I believe, as we work together, as there is strength in numbers. So, to continue, I want to give a brief description about about my background. I'm involved in research, and I'm involved in the history of American Sign Language and how it relates to the langue de signes français, or French Sign Language. A lot of my research is dealing with documentation, documents. The old Dictionary of American Sign Language, of individual signs, and the people who drew them in years gone by, and they had written descriptions of how to produce those signs. That's what my research has been. So it's valuable, but the work is intensive. I had to do an awful lot of reading of many, many texts in English and French, and the search mechanism wasn't there. I had to do it on my own, and it took years and years and years, and of course I enjoyed it. I did not suffer at all with this. It was a joy and passion for me, but it took a very, very, very long time. So now, though, as we're moving along, for me it's new, for Julie, she's been working on this for many, many years, but it's very new for me. We started looking at film now, and how we can search within a film, and we're sort of stymied with this. We watch the films, and we watch them, and then we watch them, but to search within the film is not possible at this point. So I want to describe what that looks like, so for the rest of my presentation. So, at Gallaudet University, the Gallaudet University Documentation of ASL, or GUDA, was established. We're trying to establish a corpus that we can do research within it. So, I want to talk about that. We've all seen this. So, maybe you're not familiar with this person in the deaf community, but this gentleman is George Vedetz, and he is one of the first deaf people to be captured on film using sign language. And when I did research for my historical research, this video was watched by me over and over and over again to find the sign forms, how exactly he produced them, and you know, it was really, it couldn't be processed in any kind of mechanical way. It was, the eyes were equivalent of manual search, you know what I mean? I had to do a visual search for everything that he did on my own. But we do have that rich video. Currently though, you can't access it to search within the video without watching it. Now, at Gallaudet, we happen to be the center of what is considered the center of Deaf America, as so to speak. As a result, there are many, many films there. And we have everything from, well, the one I showed you, the oldest film, and then we have alumni gatherings, we have homecoming events, we have graduation ceremonies. There are announcements about the coronavirus now that are posted. We have student posts, we have YouTube videos, and on Facebook. And then here's the Gallaudet, well, there you go, Niall. You know, there's Niall right there. And also we have formal research, like the Black ASL Project. We have data for that. We have the sociolinguistic variation films. There are so many, there's such a rich amount of video that it's a huge research, and for linguists, it's like very exciting, you know, and, but the deaf community, we're preserving it for the deaf community, preserving their language, and we have this huge corpus, and it's just kind of sitting there. It's kind of like the pictures that you have in your phone, you know, you take 1 million pictures, but you never look at them, and nobody ever sees them. It's kind of like that. It's the same concept, and it's kind of a waste. So our efforts now, what our attempt is to make it accessible and beneficial for linguistics as well as the community at large, the interpreting community, the American Sign Language users, and so forth, and instructors. Wait, oh. So many of our videos at Gallaudet are preserved at the Gallaudet Video Library that you may access, you know, and watch. Anybody can do that. It's basically labeled for metadata. We use that. Like there's a title, and sometimes there may be people's names who are in said video. There may be a date, approximate date of when that video was made, but it's not standardized, and they don't all have it, and so there's a huge discrepancy in that. If you're searching for somebody, you may find Black ASL, and that would come up a certain number of videos. Graduation ceremonies would get a certain number of videos, but the information inside, if you're looking for a specific sign, you can't find it. Or if you wanted to see like a white women who are aged between such and such, you know, who are teaching about science, you're not able to do that. You can't search like that. But imagine if you were able to search on those levels. You could teach interpreters how to sign different science vocabulary. It could happen, but we don't have it yet. So, hence, the bottom line is it's not accessible. Now, I'm not saying you can't see them. You can see them, but the effort to make them beneficial and useful at a linguistic level is difficult. You know, I mean, it's not possible. Some people could go, they go to Gallaudet, they sit and they watch the videos, and you can do that. But, I love this. These two people wrote this thing called digital detritus, right? And that is it's like trash. You know, it's garbage. Everything, the videos are just all out there willy-nilly, you know. So the department, and you know, some of the departments, like the interpreting department, we have videos of our students, and there are lots of them. The Deaf Studies department has theirs. The ASL department is those. Now, I can't go in and see those. Those are mine. They don't get shared because they feel that there's ownership to those. And people can't really see them, but there's such rich information in those videos that the general deaf community could use. But it's just sort of thrown out there. The formats are different. The file names are not standardized. And so our dream, our idea is to clean up the trash, you know, to bring the trash together and sanitize it basically, and to make it useful to people and organize it for the public. So Oh, doing time, okay. So, this is a new concept of the corpus, and I asked Julie, I said, no, we've got archives, and she's like, we don't, and so we've gone toe to toe about this, but the idea of archiving this video has to go along with sustainability and maintaining it over a long period of time. Like in a library, you've got the books right there, and you have to have people who are willing to pay for the building and pay for people who are willing to organize the collection, and that's the infrastructure of the materials. And if in a library, if you don't have that, then the whole concept goes to waste. And keep track of all of it electronically. But what we're doing now is, Gallaudet still, and any institution, struggles with money. To be honest with you, it's just not sexy to do this. It's not sexy to say that we want money to archive our collection of videos. And they're like, on an electric file format, like they want to know, where's my website, so. But we still need it. Okay, so, and also we need a consistent organization. That's what these three groups are working with, and we're trying to come to some kind of consensus about what we're doing, because we're each developing our own, and we believe it will be beneficial if the three of us get together and share what we can, so that we maintain some consistency in the organization. I talked about accessibility and sustainability already. So language, there are archives out there. There are spoken languages that have archive systems, and these are examples of what they use. And we need this. Each of us here have applied for different grants to try to get something, some sort of foundation or funding support, and that's part of what we have to do, and it's difficult. The Austin principles are really interesting. It's promoted by linguists to have open access to the data related to research. And heretofore, we are talking about sign language specifically, either you have to write it down, you see a sentence in sign language and you write it in an English gloss, which Julie will talk about later when she talks about the Signbank. But there are no pictures of signs or anything. If you're looking at just these glosses, you have to visualize what were they signing that's related to these words. And sometimes you can have screenshots, which we use more often now, more and more. But when you use video that's moving, it's rare to have that inside a written format about linguistics of sign language. Now, the same concept exists with spoken language too, because you write down a transcription of a spoken form, you're missing information if it's not the audio. So we're trying to have more access and more open for the original data. That's what the Austin principles are about, we're trying to keep this in mind for citation of our data. So the open format means, this is the big picture of what we're trying to establish. This represents that. So remember, we don't have any archives, let's just say that. So we're kind of at a loss. However, today is our first step in linking to what's already there. So, for example, we've got all these different formats and different ways of getting video. We've got the Gallaudet Video Library, which has its own address, its own website. And then we have the YouTubes, where there's how do you sign YouTube? I spell it. You sign this, you sign that, and you do just YT. What is that? IT, UT, YT. I go YouTube, is what I typically do, like you. That's just the way I sign it. Sorry guys. YouTube. Anyway, so there's the YouTube videos, and then we have Corpora, I think at Gallaudet. I don't know if Penn or RIT have that. It's a streaming site called Corpora, but there are a variety of websites and web addresses that you can use that we want to link together. We would go out and link them, stream them to our landing site. This is what our goal is, to get to this landing site. And our landing site would then have three main parts. There's metadata, there's a consensus on agreement of terms of use, and then also the annotation, or sorry, say it again. Wait. Terms of use, which would allow to, like, who's allowed to see it, what you're allowed to see and how you're using it and so on and so forth. That's the second one. The third one is annotation. Okay, so the third one in annotation is when we have the video and we label it, like what's inside the video, so we can identify that so that there are various signs and so forth, vocabulary, plus the free translation and so on and so forth. There's a lot of levels to what's going on there, but that's the basic concept. We have the videos with the translation and the annotation. Now the annotation is time intensive. It really takes specific skill to do that annotation. It's very, very skill intensive. So that's one of our hugest challenges. There's money and the annotation skill. That's the human work. And patience is what Julie was adding there. So patience is what you need for that. So, our ongoing issues, I'm sure that the three of us agree, we'll be talking about this all day. They are we have technology now, which is really awesome, and so we don't have to watch a video 5,000 times, but the problem is money and the support and effort. So the other challenge is what we've been, I wouldn't say we argue about it, but we are a perfect complement to each other. We challenge each other. Like I go, why should Gallaudet have this, all this stuff, and I'm like, money and the support. Anyway, also we have several videos from long ago with people who consented to be involved with research for a specific research project, which now we have the video, and the question is, can we use it for another purpose that those people had not yet consented? So we have to go back and get reconsents from those folks. So we're in the process now of doing that, and it seems like some people say we don't have to do some of it, but we're trying to show that we have to trust the community, that we're not going to take advantage of, we're not going to misuse it for any nefarious purpose. But these are videos from a long time ago, and we just need to get consent from people, and it's a little complicated. One very wonderful thing at Gallaudet is that we do have people who use sign language there who could be trained to do the annotation. Because remember, the annotation, with the annotation, you'll be able to see and recognize the various parts that you're trying to identify and the glossing. And that's that's hard to happen. You have to be trained on that. So we could grow our own annotator group at Gallaudet, so that's one of the things that we've set as a goal, and I think that may be mentioned later when she talks about the Signbank project. And the idea of the larger community, being a crowdsourcing, thank you, a crowdsourcing annotation effort, that might be kind of fun. Like CAPTCHA, like to capture the text and so forth. It'd be the similar thing. Could we do that, and how would we do that? So we're talking about different ideas that might be out there that could be cool. So basically, GUDA, or Gallaudet University Documentation of ASL, is an attempt to maintain ASL stories. And also we view Gallaudet as the deaf Mecca, people call it that, but it's more than that. I mean, I think really we've been sort of isolated. The deaf community has to go physically to Gallaudet to experience Gallaudet, right? But now with technology, we have the opportunity to open this up to the deaf community at large in the entire world and get access to that data. So we really feel a huge responsibility for to do that. And I think it's very serious. It's not just about, this is mine, I own it. We're not trying to do that. We want to share it. We want to get it out of the community. And really it's our goal, and that's what our vision is so far. So that ends my talk, and there's my link and my QR code. And any questions? Yeah, there's a question.
Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Hall, and it's more of a comment about possible financial support. Here in Philadelphia, we have the Comcast company, and they have a team that is very interested in developing automatic sign language recognition. I know there are problems associated with that, and trust issues perhaps, but they do have the funding, and they want a corpus to train their machine learning, and there are connections here in Philadelphia. They've reached out to us at Temple University, and they might have reached out to Penn as well, or maybe not yet. But they are very interested in this kind of thing, so it might be worthwhile trying to partner with them.
Oh, that's great, yeah. And Julie and James, thank you. I guess, I don't know why that's coming. Julie and I talked about this on the train. We were talking about this on the train coming here, and I thought, why are they so motivated by this? But you know what? Microsoft and Google and Apple and many of them really want to get involved with this. I've noticed, I'm like thinking, what are they after? There's a part of me that's sort of like suspicious of what their intent is. Like, what is their motivation actually? It's too good to be true that they really want to do that. But at the same time, it's an opportunity we should not, we don't want to ignore them either. So thank you for that. We can talk about that this afternoon, okay?
Something I look forward to. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're sorry, you're switching up. Okay. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the reconsenting for previous research.
Okay, so last summer, I think, our PhD student, or one of our PhD students, was working on developing a reconsent form for all of the videos that we do have. So we submitted that to the IRB process, and wait, hold on.
No, the IRB was considering our project exempt, but that didn't mean that we were not able to track that.
We're not required to reconsent, but we will offer opt-out. That's it.
I'm the IRB chair. So
all under
I do have a better understanding of what that means right now. Let me just explain that exempt does not mean that we have to do it. It just means that we have to submit our documentation, but we don't have to do it repeatedly. We just submit it one time. So if our protocols with the people that we're working with change, with those subjects change, once we get the initial approval and then we are so-called exempt, the IRB is interested in maintaining those human subjects. They want to make sure that they are protecting those groups, especially the medically fragile groups. So they will definitely keep an eye on those sources. However, also something to keep in mind, I'm sorry I'm going on about IRB.
Shall be my guest, Julie.
The human subject research is a very specific group. So I don't believe that they follow them in a general way. I know that they have our research doesn't follow that, but in terms of the general terms of use, that's what that comes under. So we have our terms of use. And with that, we see who wants to use that, and we plan to examine their language and such features. And if we do determine that, then we bring that to the IRB at that point.
Also, I'm thinking of looking for it within the film and asking them for reconsent. That's part of,
You want to talk more about that?
So I do think we've talked about it a little bit, which is, well, let's say we can't find them. Then what do we do? So we have an opt-out option that we're considering. If they don't want to be in it, then they have to let us know. You know what I'm saying? And then we would remove them from the video. So that process, we have to rely on that process, but we've got, I want to say, thousands and thousands of videos. So we haven't really even faced the reality of that yet, but we're sort of moving on step by step. Yeah, so, okay. All right, any other questions? No, okay, thank you very much. I told Jamie, Jamie introduced us, but she didn't introduce herself, so I'm going to introduce her. And Meredith, so. Jamie Fisher, who works here at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the director of ASL and senior lecturer of language in the Department of Linguistics here. She grew up as an ASL user. She is a CODA from Philadelphia. She has a BA in English education from Colby College and a master's in education in culture and society and an EDD in higher education from the University of Pennsylvania. She is interested in the deaf community and deaf culture and how it partners with research, and that's where her main interests are. Of course, she is documenting or annotating the Philadelphia ASL variety. Okay. I turn it now over to Meredith Tamiga. And she is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics here at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the director of language variety and the Cognition Lab. She has a BA in linguistics from McGill College and a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. She is very interested in psycholinguistic aspects of sociolinguistics and how to recognize and recognition and memory in the variety of dialects. Her first project is related to sign language linguistics, was documenting the Philadelphia variety of American Sign Language, and so I turn it over to Meredith and Jamie for their talk.
I'm going to start by talking about the research that we've taken a look at. We're going to focus on dominance and the reversal of dominance that we see in Philadelphia ASL. I want to provide a little bit of background to any of you who might not be familiar with sign language and how dominance works, how it's featured in ASL. You can see that I use two hands in my signing today. One of my hands tends to be my dominant hand as a signer. Now, the first person to take a look at this feature about hand dominance is Battison. His research was conducted in 1974. He looked at dominance and hand shapes, looking at two-handed signers and how those hand shapes might be different with two hands. That you can see one hand, if you will, is more dominant, does more of the signing, and the non-dominant hand, if you will, is more limited in its use of hand shapes and movement. When one is signing, primarily, the hand that you use to write or to fingerspell tends to be the dominant hand of the signer. Now I want to talk about the reversal of that dominance. In using sign language in general, many people might be right or left hand dominant. Sometimes, regardless of what your dominance is, you will see reversals. Not depending on a word, but within the utterance, there will be a reversal in the use of that dominance. You might be dominant on your right-hand side and then switch that dominance to your left-hand side. There are reasons behind that switch, or why one hand might be dominant over the other. We're going to talk about the possible reasons for the dominance and for the switching, the roles that are played in that dominance. It could be that a person is holding something in one hand and that forces the dominance to the other hand. So we do have two hands. We are able to sign with both. So we are able to switch our dominance. If one hand is busy, that dominance can be switched to the other hand. So historical research has been done on that dominance reversal. The first, as I mentioned, was done by Battison. He talked about signers who may occasionally switch their dominance when they want to put a focus on a piece of language. In 1985, we then saw Frischberg with his research, her research, thank you so much. And you might have seen people using sign language and switching their dominance, and that might be based on discourse reasoning. Within the phrase, you might see a switch to dominance. Again, that might be because of the nature of the discourse. And that also might be for whole phrases or embedded sentences. In 2007, we saw research done by Nielsen, who took a look at signers, one particular individual, examined that individual's signing, and noted that that dominance really switched very few times, a very small percentage of the time. Just 1% of the time. In 2008, we saw research done by Hendricks. This was a dissertation that was done for LIU, Jordanian Sign Language. The observation was that those who used this reversal in dominance were trying to show a contrast between 2 points of view, or were trying to show transitions within the discourse, and therefore use that reversal of dominance. Most of the time, those users were very young signers who demonstrated that reversal. Another study was done by Krasborn and Safar in 2016, talking about the corpus study of dominance reversal, which was in the Netherlands, or NGT. This analysis was done in phonetic forms, contexts, and discourse functions. Also found ways to annotate very quickly those reversals and more easily. And the finding was that all signers do reverse their dominance pretty frequently. And these reversals happen regardless of if it's a narrative or an interactive register that's being used.
Okay. All right, so we got interested in this phenomenon because Jamie was noticing it, I think especially in a lot of the videos as we were working on sort of annotation and thinking a little bit about our participants in the Philadelphia Signs Project. And so we decided to start thinking about how we could quickly quantify how much this phenomenon was happening at all. So we're going to be showing you some preliminary data from 9 of our participants from the Philadelphia Signs Project. So this is conversational interviews, video recorded here in Philadelphia, done by native deaf Philadelphians who are also native users of ASL, interacting sort of with each other in a conversational interview. So of the participants we're going to be showing you today, 6 of them are Black and 3 of them are white. But this is actually data from across 13 different interviews. So you're going to see that we have data from the same signer in different conversations. For each of these participants, we coded an average of 18 minutes of their continuous signing. And when I say that we coded it, what I mean that we did is that we identified all of the stretches that were that signer signing continuously, and then within that, identified all of the stretches that were reversed for their dominance, right? So they might, if they're right-handed, be switched to using their left hand as the dominant hand for some portion of the time. So we're classifying all of their continuous signing as either being switched or not switched. And then what we're going to be showing you is percentage of each signer's total signing time where the dominance is reversed. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that quantitative data, and we want to show you some things that make us think that there's social conditioning to this dominance reversal, that it's related, that it's basically sort of maybe sociolinguistic in some way. So we're going to show you differences between individuals and suggest that there might be racial differences in this phenomenon. We're going to show you a little bit of style shifting data between different conversations with a single signer, and then convergence between another signer and his conversational partners. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie to give you some video examples supporting the idea that there is something sort of discourse functional to these kind of reversals, right? So examples that show that we get reversal in ways that seem like signers are using it to do things. So she'll show you, first of all, that our white signers use it in much more limited contexts, but the examples from the black signers in this small sample illustrate the use of reversal for things like simultaneously occurring events, contrasts, and different reference. So this will also show you some fun evidence that dominance can switch within an utterance. Okay, so first to our quantitative data. So we'll look at some graphs. So this first graph, I will walk you through it briefly. On our y-axis, we're looking at the percentage of the time that the dominance is reversed for each signer. And then you can see along the bottom, we have each of our participants who we coded here by name. And the green bars are black signers and the red bars are white signers. So what you can see here is that overall, the black signers are using dominance reversal a lot more than the white signers. Not all of the black signers use dominance reversal. There are some who don't, but everyone who shows us a high percentage of dominance reversal is one of our black participants. So we were really struck by this. Okay, so this next graph has a little story behind it. So one of our black signers, Denisha, came in and did an interview and everything, sort of in the normal way. And then she spoke with Jamie later, right? So they were, I don't know if reached out to Jamie to talk a little bit about the ways in which she had sort of assumed that in that interview context, that the sort of norms for her signing style should be quite standard, right? And that this was maybe not actually her most sort of comfortable or natural signing style, that she was sort of trying to sign in a particular way because of the context. So that was the first interview. So then when she reached out to Jamie to tell about these sort of expectations, we said, oh, would you be willing to come back in and sign in your, sort of what you see as your more natural signing style? I believe she used the term ebonics to describe it, right? So we get this, intentional shift towards sort of a use of black ASL in the second interview, which was done with the same interviewer, by the way. So what we can see is that, so Denisha is one of our participants who uses a lot of reversal, right? What we see is she uses it about 10% of the time in her first interview, where she's moving towards more sort of standard norms. But then in her second interview, she's using it almost twice as much of the time when she's intentionally shifting towards these sort of black ASL norms. Okay, so I mentioned that the interviewer for these two interviews with Denisha was the same person. So we thought, oh, it would be cool to look at what he's doing. So that's Dominic, so I'll show you on this next slide. So the green bars here are the same green bars you were just looking at, right? So what we see is that Dominic also uses a fair amount of reversal. So each of these facets here, each of these little graphs is a separate conversation that Dominic was involved in. We can see that when Dominic was himself interviewed as a participant, which he did before he became an interviewer for us, he was interviewed by someone, a black woman named Janessa, who doesn't use very much reversal, and he hardly ever used reversal in that interaction. But then when he interviewed Denisha, and she uses a lot more reversal, we see that he also starts to use more reversal. And then in that second conversation with Denisha, where she's escalating how much reversal she uses, Dominic is also escalating in how much reversal he uses. So we think that this is a phenomenon that in sociolinguistics we would call convergence, where people become more like each other in interaction, right? And so that was some sort of an exciting evidence that there's something sort of socially meaningful about this, right? That people are attending to it, they can perceive it in their interlocutors, and that they can sort of shift how much they do it according to the circumstance and according to who they're interacting with. Go back to Jerry. great.
I'm going to show you 4 different clips now. This is Jenny. She's obviously a white signer. And you'll be able to see the captioning so that you can understand the conversation here. This is like Nielsen's research in 2007 that I talked about. You'll see just that 1% of reversal. She's going to represent that research here. That was pretty brief, a short clip. You can just see the 1% when she used one hand as a reversal. It's so in this second clip, this is Dominic.
This is David.
This is David. Dominic is doing the interviewing. He talks about using that reversal to make a point or to pull focus to something. That's the purpose of the reversal, but continuing the dialogue at the same time. Right there. So you can see first you referred to the name on one side, and then you did the explanation on the other side, and then came back to the first side. Here's Denisha. She's showing that dominant switching to show a comparison, an opposite, a contrast. So you see her saying, I can't say black, I can't say white, and using different dominants to demonstrate the difference. So here's more of a complication. She was the first person being interviewed by Dominic. She was using this reversal several times. Now I want you to look and see, because I did slow down the video a little bit so you can capture this. I want you to see when she talks about those hearing influences first, the advisor, the hearing advisor, or the counselor first. And then you can see how the counselor then uses that dominance to change roles, to role shift, and how role shifting will affect that dominance reversal. It is a little more complicated, but you can see when she signs about the hearing influence, and within that phrase you see that dominant switch, the hearing counselor. She takes on a role with her signing. She puts the people in space, and within the taking on the role, she changes her dominance to reference a certain person, their comments, and what they had to say. So, in summary, we saw here the preliminary evidence. Dominance reversal is used more by black signers, but not by all black signers. They don't all represent this reversal. Denisha, the clip that we just watched, you saw her shifting, her style shifting, leaning more toward typical black ASL signing that we see here in Philadelphia. And then we see with Dominic, his convergence, that evidence from the clip of the dominance shifting and the reasons behind it. and supporting that it might be stylistic from the others we saw from deletion. We also see with black signers that dominance shift. There is a reason for it. There are functions behind it. Previous literature has told us that we really should not be seeing this feature, but in fact we do see it. And consistent with Krasborn and Safar, we do see this shift happen regularly. There are pervasive and systematic, meaningful reasons that would offer further inquiry. Thank you very much. I have a few additional comments.
I have a comment, or no?
Want me to do it? Just thinking about the previous work, the way they said, well, you know, if you do switch, it happens after the phrase is finished. But more recently, Krasborn and Safar, and your work, look, you know, trying to document this in the corpus. That in the past, you know, using the available tools and analysis, you're watching it and you're trying to figure it out. It's not easily to stop the language and then make those annotations. So a corpus would force you to really look at things up close, and I think that would be helpful in the different pieces, so that you can stop it and then really parse it out. And then, sorry, I'm saying something.
Elon.
In Elon, the annotation software program, where you're able to look at a video and then can transcribe it and connect it up so that it's matched up in time, and then that you have to make a beginning and an end. It forces you to do that, and that forced choice is kind of new.
Exactly.
Right? And it makes you kind of realize you'll see things that you weren't able to see before, which is awesome.
Thank you for that. Thank you. This is just fascinating. And there does seem to be a lot of standardization from L1 users. Now, as a teacher or an L2 user, I teach those L2 users. And I think it might be a little less acceptable. I'm working with a student and really that influence from that L1 perspective when it comes to that shifting. So I'm thinking about those two different populations, right? As an instructor. When we're teaching those L2 students, we're teaching them those finite rules, very specific and finite rules, which might be different in typical organic use. So they don't necessarily follow those rules when the language is used more typically. For teaching purposes, I do believe we have to provide some type of structure. It can't be all loosey-goosey, if you will, but at the same time, we do have to acknowledge what's out there with deaf users and how deaf people are using the language. Nothing ever is represented always in the same fashion. I see
Hold on a
lots of other
second.
people.
I can move me on.
Thank you.
So L1 users are fluent, they know when to use this shift, but L2 users might not be as knowledgeable about how to do it.
That is a good point. A lot of people out there might say that it's wrong, or they might say, oh, what's the reason? They might say that they're switching dominance because they just don't have a skill level, a certain skill level, but that's just not true. That dominance is required by a user of the language, even a very qualified user of the language. Some of the most proficient signers we see out there are using that dominance reversal.
I have 3 questions, but I know if we run out of time, just shut me up.
The first one, that reversal. Can you say that?
Okay, what happens?
Does that co-vary with other features of Black ASL? Is the first question.
Joseph saying something. Talking about that role shift or dominant shift, does that co-vary with any other features of Black ASL?
I haven't looked at that yet, we just haven't had a chance to look at that yet. We haven't had an opportunity.
Secondly, any of those people aware that you're doing this, that you're monitoring for this? Do they know?
Are they the subjects?
Right, that's my question. Do they know that they're being observed for this?
For this particular purposes, no, they don't.
Okay. So did they know, okay, were they cognizant that they were doing the dominance reversals?
We didn't specifically ask them. We did not tell them what we were looking for.
Like last night, Dr. Hill talked about the attitude, their beliefs about Black ASL. And maybe they don't realize that it includes this dominance reversal, which is interesting.
Very interesting.
And then my third and last question, I think, is for Meredith. A prediction about, so you talked about noticing this as a social thing. And I'm wondering, could it be considered a cognitive thing? For example, with syntax or syntactic priming, if you came up with an environment or a situation in order to really evaluate this and not disconnect it from the social aspect and see how people go back and forth, do you predict that they would still copy that dominance reversal or not?
So definitely, this is the kind of thing that I would expect you could prime, right? In that you could probably get people to do it, because actually there's all kinds of things about body language that people converge on, right? So it's not necessarily that the convergence is, sort of motivated by sort of social, alignment. It can be motivated by very low level things. So I think that when we see that convergence type pattern, is that like social accommodation or is that priming? I used to be really interested in the question about what's the difference between these two things, and I'm increasingly coming around to thinking that they're actually the same thing, that it's just social priming, right? Like that the way you converge is through priming and the way that you accommodate for social purposes is priming, right? But it's all the same. But I would also add that I don't think that there's not an obvious sort of processing type explanation that I can think of for why we would get differences across racial groups within Philadelphia. So if that turns out to be true, then I think that suggests that there's something socially conditioned to the phenomenon as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for a coffee break. We have some donuts inside over here. And what time do we want to reconvene?
5 minutes, but we
5
don't
minutes? All right. Why don't we take 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, so everybody back at 11:15.
So now, I'd like to thank you all for staying. I'm going to introduce, Joseph Hill and Corinne Okina, and they will talk about DIVA, documenting individual variation in ASL, or DIVA.
As you can see here, this is our topic. We're documenting variances in ASL. It doesn't mean DIVA like somebody with a big ego. That's not what the acronym before. It just was a nice name and it was easy for people to remember, so that's why we call it DIVA. So, the purpose of this project is that we wanted to establish a study on social linguistic variance at RIT. There are many students that come from their respective home states, and they bring with them their variances in signing, which is very interesting to see. So it's all, we get to see all these variances and are able to document that with many varieties. You might not know, and we don't capture everybody, but we want to increase awareness about non-common varieties of uses of American Sign Language. And we look at their attitudes and perspectives of these ASL variances. Some people feel like it's for a specific purpose, or they feel like they really want to look further into how they use variances. It's important because we want to include different community practice networks, and so we've been looking at different categories: race, age, sex, and class. And it's limited in that way because you're not showing local meaning with these variants as well, so we need to include their local networks as well and see how it signs mean for them in their specific context. With geographic. There is technology that we want to leverage. We have apps, we have websites, and we're thinking that we could use, for example, what you talked about with crowdsourcing in order to collect information instead of us doing everything. We can get it from others. In a way, we need community to be engaged in this type of research. We've noticed and observed that a lot of documentation historically, many people are not represented well. And so we want to change that narrative. There have been various studies that typically include specific geographical regions. For example, California, or the DC area, or Maryland, Virginia, Delaware area. Also Massachusetts, mostly because they have linguistic labs there that have been there for quite some time. Gallaudet has its own in the DC area. California has their own, so it makes sense that that seems to be the pattern. But we need more representation from various geographical locations. The other thing is, and we've noticed in our studies about sociolinguistics, is that gender seems to be fairly represented on an equal basis. But diversity, including non-binary people, are not well represented right now. Age, I think we have a good different variety of age representation. It usually has to do with the time that they were educated. Some of the older people that went to deaf schools, and then some of the younger generation that are mostly mainstream, for example. And so then people in their 30s, that were in their 30s during the 1970s, or were in the 30s in the 2010, it's a very different era. And so we need to really try to document it according to their respective context. Race is often represented just in two respects, black and white, for contrasted purposes, but it doesn't include other racial identities. We want to incorporate more of that. And at the end, the LGBTQ representation as well. There is documentation, but really not enough. It's very limited. In the past, we tried to video, and then over time, we were able to afford the technology, and then now everybody can just use their phone to video. I see people using their iPads to record information as well, which is very nice. So the possibilities are there, and we've noticed a shift on what we can do to capture a lot of this, and we're going to continue to leverage that. My presenter and I have been working on this project, and we've been frustrated in three respects. Resources, getting people involved and engaged in our study, documentation, we've been limited with that. The other thing is finding funding. We submit for grants and we get mostly turned down, which can be frustrating and problematic. And I think it's more of how we really frame the research project in a way that would attract funders. We're still trying to figure out how to do that. The third thing is archiving. we really do have a lot of archives, and as you can see when Emily talked about in her presentation, that there's a whole trove of information, but a lot of stuff has not yet been archived, and so we need to centralize all of this information, and it's been very challenging trying to do so, and I was thinking that maybe we could talk about what our project can do to try to change that dynamic.
So, Joseph and I found ways to address 3 problems. We started with this. And when we started this project at NTID, we thought, how can we find funding? So NTID has some internal budget. So we applied for that money and we got it. So that was good. And then there was a 2-year grant that started this project. So it's just basically scratching the surface, and this is where we've begun. So for this 2 years, we have had 43 participants representing 24 states, which isn't bad. It's better than it had been. We are trying to capture 2 people from each state, which would help us to then identify if the variety is related to its region or related to some other sociolinguistic factor or social feature. We have gathered so far 6 hours, 3 minutes, 6 hours of interviews in some. There are 2 types of elicitation. One is just an interview, a classic interview, and sociolinguistic interview, which to draw out information from the person. And the second is what we're calling lexical elicitation. So we thought about getting some specific vocabulary that we wanted to elicit, and then we saw that we had in that variety, or maybe a new variation that we might have noticed from the other, that students are using in NTID. So from that, we have about 5 hours of lexical elicitation interviews. From that, in terms of vocabulary categories, we've got 11 lexical categories, which represent different kinds of vocabulary. Anyway, and from that we see, like, for example, there's the classic variation of things that we know about, like birthday, for example. Everybody knows the birthday variety, that everybody's got their own sign for birthday. Anyway, but then we still are seeing some, is that still happening? And we want to look into that further and see whether that, we need to look into that further. Other kinds, like a social motivation variety, we think that there are a lot of people who are interacting, and then if they have different kinds of student groups or friends or people who basically are together often, they typically copy each other's signing style or signing, and so that's involved. Like one person might be from California and another person might be from DC, but if they hang out a lot, then they're sharing their variety, and so that can affect each other's signing. So, and then the last category are, but at NTID we talk about the variety of kinds of deaf people that are there. So we have deaf people who identify as hard of hearing, and then we also have CODAs are included in this because a lot of people there, it's their language as well. So we don't only think people with hearing loss, but we think of people who grow up with signing, and maybe from their home state they've incorporated a particular signing, such as Jamie. So then we thought of let's talk a little bit about who is at NTID. So this is what this chart represents. I think it's a little different from Gallaudet, and maybe in demographics, but it might be changing. We do have a lot of students who are mainstream. We've got who are discovering their deaf identity at NTID. So they come from a mainstream environment. They may have had one interpreter their whole life that followed them through their education, and then they come to NTID and they are culture shocked with how many people there are to interact with who know sign language. So a lot of folks grew up with their state signs from that interpreter. They come to NTID and they take in all these other variants from the other students, and I think that's something that we really, really need to look at. When we say 73% of our students come from mainstream environment and only 27% from center schools for deaf students. There's also this information that in 2017, We recently actually lost our demographer, who was the person who took all this, made all these statistics happen. So it's only go up to 2017. We don't have anything since then. So
That's correct. But we have started to collect data in 2018 as well. Prior to that, it pretty much still matches up. And so we're still collecting data since 2018.
great. So
As you can see, the different representation based on NTID's annual report. Over 1,000 students attend NTID at the RIT campus, and so you can see a breakdown of geographical locations that are represented. 17% in the South, 15% in the Midwest, 21% in the Midwest, and then the Northeast is 47%. The data that we've collected is very proportional to this as far as the representation. We had 4 students from the West, 4 from the South. Most of our students came from the Northeast, or from the Midwest and the Northeast. As you can remember, we talked about the 110 different ideas that we were documenting, different signs, and we've categorized them. One are traditionals that we've documented over the years that we've been tracking. For example, one study included something regarding using signs on the face or whether it was not located near the face, like rabbit or lemon, and how that was signed in that variance. Other signs that we see frequently, awareness, whether it's up higher for awareness or a little bit lower, for example, we took note of that. And then documenting when we see signs, for example, like social justice, which we'll depict in just a bit. It's a very specific term. And if people really don't know it, if they do know it, they'll sign for it specifically. For people that don't know, will just fingerspell it or use a different sign. So that often shows which group that they have an affinity towards and who they interact with, because they use specific signs as compared to other groups. And then, use of technology emerging. Now we're coming up with different signs, and there have been more and more signs that have been invented. Over time, they've become much more standardized. One thing that we've studied is the variances in birthday. From the book Signs Across America, which was published in 1984, you can see the variance of birthday signs. They documented 23 different signs. This is very common, especially in California. This one is more common in Florida. And then there are other signs that are documented here as well. This is also a sign that's used in New York. This is an example of her sign that from New York City, very similar. I'll show it to you now. They use that sign, and then in the next sentence, she said, oh, that's how we used to sign it, and now we signed it more standardized. And then we have California. And then a person from Michigan. We've documented this consistency with variances, and then we noticed many people prefer using this sign. That's the lexicon, but now we're going to get into the phonology, so you can see the differences. Interesting enough, watching these films and seeing how students produce the sign movie in various ways. Various different articulations. And I think it's worthwhile to really capture this variation. Here's one from Washington. So you can see the palm is above the non-dominant hand. Here the palm is lower. It's in the middle of the non-dominant hand. And this one you have a non-dominant hand as being more flat as opposed to the woman from Washington whose hand was almost a five-hand shape. This one is more flat with a change in palm orientation on the non-dominant hand.
And what's interesting about the phonology is that people often think about vocabulary variety, and they're really hooked into that and the variety of signs that are out there. But for linguists, sometimes we like to think about phonology, and that becomes very interesting because we want to talk about the level of accent, as it were. So if we document this type of variation, you see these tiny forms, these phonetic differences in how they use the passive hand for the sign movie, we can understand more about a dialect. This might be a dialectic thing that we're seeing in this variety.
And so far, we have 43 people that we've documented. Most of them have just done one sign. We're still collecting more subjects, and again, it would be interesting to see these variations, and then when we collect more, you can see some consistencies on phonology and different patterns that are used in different geographical areas. Okay. Socially motivated variances. If you're not as much in the in crowd, you might use a different sign. This is one variation from Washington. She used SJ for social justice. Very familiar with that term. I use it frequently myself in the work that I do. But I have seen people who talk about this as presenters, and they do this sign. And it's a very specific sign for people that are very knowledgeable of what that entails. For other people, you click on this other person.
It's easy. I can see your face, yeah.
You can see she's really not sure about what that all means. She signs it that way. It's correct to fingerspell it, but again, based on her facial expression, it seems like she's not as privy to that information in the people that use it. And I'm familiar with this variance. This person is taking classes, but here's their use of the sign. Social justice, which is also appropriate. That has to do with your familiarity, your background, who you socialize with, that makes the difference in the variation. Is your part or my part?
Take it away.
Okay. This is also has to do with social media. We've got Instagram. So these two variations and how that's signed. It's interesting to see those. So far, there are just 2 iterations of that sign. That's what I've seen most commonly. And here's the other one. It's more initialized as an IG sign. Either of them both of them are very prevalent. With tablet, there's the iPad, or if it's not an Apple device, unfortunately, then we sign it just tablet. We fingerspell that. And so you have to ask, what's your sign? And that's what we did, and then we got these 3 variations. Again, just fingerspelling the idea of what a tablet is. That's what one person did. However, here's another sign. I've seen this used for both iPads and other tablet devices as well. That's very much used functionally. And then at the bottom, talking about the shape of the screen. This was very interesting, and it hadn't really been documented previously in different studies. And it also emerges in the ASL curriculum from time to time, so I've been trying to track those sign variations. Also, the influence in how it's widely adopted. Here's an example that's not often used in ASL curriculum, but you can see it depends who you hang around with. That will influence how you articulate this sign. There are 11 altogether, we've selected 4. This person is from Minnesota. There's another person from Minnesota that signed it backwards. So I guess it goes both ways. Here we have somebody from New Jersey. This is very common. Get to Massachusetts. You also see this quite a bit. One thing that struck me was Alabama's use of this sign. Well, there you go. There's another sign for her. Okay. Sociolinguistic categories and the different waves. First, we talk about social categories that have to do with race, age, sex, and class. Because there's a hierarchy there, and people that have the most privileged are at the top. And often there's a tie-in with the variance that has to do with that hierarchy. People that are more higher up differ on how they sign as compared to people that are lower down. This doesn't include local networks that we wanted to include in our study more about the historical context to help us really define meaning for individual people. And then we've gotten down to the third wave where we've seen how there's intentionality here on choosing these variations in order to show identity or how they relate to a group of people. If you're more wealthy and then somebody wants to get into that group, they'll sign a certain way. Or there might be another network that's very specific, that has to do with a specific activity, interest, or hobby that you feel an affinity towards. And we're looking into this community of practice that influence these variations in this third wave and trying to incorporate that in our study. And that has to do with NTID, because at NTID they have very specific practice that you don't see elsewhere, so we tried to include that as well.
So this is one example of a kind of community of practice. At NTID, when you come to college the first time, we have something called the SVP. And that SVP class is for students who are deaf who come to the program before they start their first semester. And they interact a lot with other students. I think it's a 2-week or 1 month.
I think it's 2 weeks.
Okay, sometimes it changes from year to year. Anyway, so the interesting thing is that this community of practice continues then throughout their college experience. Those people, when they come back 10 years, 20 years later, they come back, they already know the people who were in their SVP. They sign it, they sign themselves, they apply that SVP as their own sign for themselves, you know what I'm saying? So
typically they'll use the B handshake for things that they come up with. For example, they'll say, look, or
Each class comes
so
up
each class
Or
has its own
V's.
identity.
Each class comes up with
their own use of this V handshake. And one time they signed President Trump like this with a V.
That was their sign.
That was what they had decided upon. And every year they have their own signs that have to do with the V handshake that they come up with.
So what's interesting about this COP is it helps us to really understand these categories of students and who interact together as they go through their college experience as a cohort. They support each other. They typically will interact and share signs among themselves. Like there may be for example, indexing identity and how to show who they are as a person. as part of a particular group called indexing identity.
For example, at NTID, there are various student clubs. Some students, they go on more engineering, psychology clubs with mostly hearing students on the main campus. And so then other students are involved in different networks. There might be a student that strongly identifies as oral, and they would hang out with oral peers. Other people really want to be involved in that community, want to hang out with different clubs that represent that. It's still a work in progress. For example, you might see language ideology and how people view signs that are used. For one example, so a student said, oh, well, they use this in their home state. They use this sign for rock. Right? But then when they go to NTID, people say, what is that? That doesn't make sense. You're talking about prom, or what are you talking about? So then they become more standardized in their use of the vocabulary. But other people would say, I'm proud of who I am and where I'm from. I'm going to keep using my sign variants, and we've noticed that in our research.
I think really, we actually haven't looked at the pairs discussing their deaf experience in American Sign Language. We do have pairs of people who talk about their experience as a dyad, coming to NTID. Recently, Joseph talked about, this, like he talked about, I change my sign when I come here. People talk about that experience, but we haven't actually looked at it yet. We've got the data, but we haven't really analyzed it.
And signs come up that seem to be have no English equivalents, so trying to document that.
Okay. That's it. All right, here we are. Here's our team.
So can we hold questions for just a few minutes? We want to give the time remaining to our last presenters, and then we'll do questions at the end, if you don't mind, if that's okay with everybody? Okay.
We're now setting up for our next presenter, who is Julie Hosang. Still trying to remember how to pronounce that one. And she will be presenting about ASL Signbank. Shut up.
Okay, I know it's been a long morning. Thank you for persevering through the morning. I'm going to talk to you about something we refer to as ASL Signbank, which I'm going to represent in this way. Because we take the sign for sign, and then a list of signs that might come with it, and we develop this sign to represent that term. So throughout the morning, we've had a rich conversation about ASL, and my work is involved in viewing many, many videos that use those language variations in the clips as we've talked about them this morning. I want to preserve our research, our documentation, and have opportunities to share that information with the greater community. But the question is, how do we access the information as it's captured? And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before I do so, I just want to ask you to briefly watch this video. That's really something, isn't it? Watching all that language variety we were talking about, the importance of documentation, and how do I want to say that? But yes, that these were underrepresented groups that have been captured here, and tremendous and beautiful variety that we see there. Different ages, all sorts of different groups represented. So you captured lots of signs as you were watching. Little boy, that is the cutest little boy in the world, right? He sounds funny. So your brain grabs that quickly. You might have seen them sign black or rocket, little individual pieces of language, but if you back up and try to look for those pieces of language by entering it on a keyboard, you won't be able to find it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So the way we make information on the computer accessible is through the use of annotation. And that simply means adding information to a piece of text or a piece of video. I'll give you an example. Here, this is YouTube. There are playlists. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this playlist. This is how it typically looks. You have different topics. You can follow by date or who posted it, for example, maybe the name of a channel or tags that have also been added to the video. So that information is in a text that you can type and find the video you're looking for. But you have to manually put that in, and most people are familiar with this process. So this is information that you need to be able to find specific signs embedded within certain videos to search them. So the information on the video itself, the signs within the video, have not been annotated. And to a point when we're not able to search and find the piece of language that we're looking for. So we have developed this tool that will allow us to capture this information within the video. I know we all know that ASL doesn't have a written form or a written system. We do utilize English, as referred to it in a gloss, that English system. Its written form to represent ASL signs. We do use notation and transcription. It's very technical, and for people who are interested in phonology, not many people are, to use that particular tool. But on the other side of the screen, we do have some attempts to try to write and capture American Sign Language, but it just hasn't taken off in the community. It's not something that's widely used. We just don't have a good system currently to really represent, a tool to represent American Sign Language. We typically use glossing, and I have talked about that glossing in and of itself is not a great system. It's what we have for now. But generally, what we see today with people who are working with language use, research is the use of the gloss to capture that language. But that really is very context dependent. You have to look and understand what the language is referring to. For example, the sign for mother. What is the person referring to? Their mother, the person might be representing the word mama, or they might then write down the word mom, or mother, or mommy for that same ASL sign. It's very contextual based. So for us to be able to type in a term and find the sign is more complicated. We're looking for the idea, the ID gloss, the ID, the identifying term. So this sign, regardless of whatever context or English word that's used, we're going to choose one term that's going to always capture that one sign within the video. So that practice is out there. But now what we need is a system to connect it to annotation. And that's a search. That's what I'm referring to, a search machine. so that you can type in the term that you're looking for, and you can actually count, you can group, you can organize and source information. That's what researchers are looking for. If they want to recognize different signs for different terms, they want to be able to capture and organize that information. This is a term that I used very recently this morning for annotation. Many of us in the field of gestures or American Sign Language use ELAN. ELAN is an annotation software. You can see the image is above and the annotation is below. So I talked about anti-glossing. So back to this term. When you're producing a sign, you want to be able to recognize its form consistently. I'll show you an example. So here's ID glossing, whether a person is referencing a sign with one hand or two hands or repeatedly, or the modifications, those variants as we've been talking about, but that general meaning needs one standard way of referencing it so that machine can read it easily and find a field user. I want to emphasize that ID glossing right now is a labeling system. It's a way for the computer to recognize it, but it's not its own system. That ID glossing will allow the person creating the video to have their representation. What we need is a way to recognize that ID glossing, and we understand that ASL doesn't just refer to one word or two words. The information is shared between the two users. So how the two users are using the language and how the computer is able to find the word are two separate things. It's not a one-to-one connection. For some things, it's pretty easy. There's a sign for ball. We're all going to use the same English text, right? Or nobody's going to come up with the word spear to represent that sign. But there are other things that are more complicated. This sign, for example. There are many English terms that could represent that sign. So whatever I decide, the person creating the video decides will be stored in the language options. And then
2 weeks later.
And then 2 weeks later, I might forget the option that I chose in that moment. So this is a way for me to store the choice that was made. So that's how we came up with Signbank. Now, we were not the first to come up with Signbank. We're following models that have already been created. We stand on the shoulders of others who came before us. So, for example, here's a first example. This comes to us from Australia. This is Trevor Johnson. He created this original Signbank. And you can see other iterations that have followed. Most recently, NGT from Holland. They also created a system, and then others reached out to them, and as we did, to create our own use of Signbank. And this is all possible because of this project. /SLAASH, which is Sign Language Acquisition, Annotation, Archiving, and Sharing, /. That A has 3 different uses. Because we started with this particular concept about language acquisition, this data set. But we need the infrastructure for annotation, for archiving, and sharing. So this could be used for any set of data, but / in particular has actually 3 meanings that can be used. So we decided to start with this project. Now, this project has allowed us to create Signbank. We partnered with this other project, which is ASL Lex. They are a partner. Signbank has found a way to recognize these glosses, these ID glosses. We didn't sit around and decide what words we were going to select for this usage. What we did was we used a series of videos. We recognized the signs that were being used, and we borrowed them from the videos that were already in place. So it's user-based, so you can see what's being used out there and we follow the user. But the data is very varied. You saw just recently, some are for children, some languages coming from further away, some from closer. So we use some professional actors to re-demo those pieces of language, and sometimes in some very odd ways. Sometimes you only saw a very narrow part of the face. Sometimes people would use signs in repetitive ways or in less repetitive ways. So we had to analyze how those signs were being produced without a lot of facial grammar so that the form could match what we were seeing out there. Really watching that facial grammar because the form could really throw off and cause a mismatch. So we wanted to reduce that facial production. We wanted to create a template, if you will, that could be replicated. Also, we were very proud of all of the different signers, the different ages and races, and the representation that we were able to find to demonstrate ASL.
A few minutes left.
I'm really not going to talk about this at length, but all Signbank topics and words, pieces of vocabulary,
Word
principles, those templates all come from this source. And you can easily access that on your own later, feel free. So we are online. You're always feeding this information with the glosses, the videos, images, pictures, everything is available in list view. You can see the videos here, the annotation, the ID gloss, the translation equivalents. Because often there are many, many words you can assign to one sign and you don't know the choice that was made by the signer. So that can really cause a loss if we don't have a lot of possible word options. So we try to provide as many options as we can so that you can search a variety of terms and ultimately find the product you're looking for. And then it goes down the line. So if you click, then the screen will open up and you'll get one view. You can click on the video, and then you can see the second sign, and you'll see without a lot of that facial information, but the annotation is beside the video. You'll see the label here, the phonological information below. Then you'll see the role within the sentence, how it was being produced. You'll see the frequency of the sign. You'll see whether it's related to other signs, as we were talking about Holland's sign language and the other partnerships, so we can compare it to other sign banks and get a multiple of points of views and perspectives. If you remember, I was talking about well, I didn't say this, I think, but the limitization of how those signs are organized. And one way to picture that is the relationship between the signs. So you can click and see those relationships for yourself, for example, the possible relationships. So if you're producing the sign in the same way, then it will make those connections. If the meanings are the same, it will make those connections. A hyponym, for example, that means that there might be like an umbrella sign, like food. I always switch those up. Is it the hyponym? Which one is the hypernym? Or the hyponym? I always switch those two terms. But basically the name of the category and then all the specific examples within the category. Food, and then there's hungry French fries. So generally, you'll see things in a dictionary that are a very flat structure, and of course this is not a flat structure. It has great variety and movement. I was recently showing you the research that you have access to, and that is free. You don't have to pay anything to have access to that research, but this is a public view. I think this is from Philadelphia. You can see that it's been documented from Philadelphia, so it's there are regional variants that you're going to see here, but most are state by state. If you're looking for a particular city in Philadelphia or DC or the variants within those cities and the signs you might see, then you really have to put those in, but generally it's state by state. We're always getting more reporting, so there's more corpus information out there that are trying to be shared and fed into the system, and that's an ongoing project. This is Signbank and their annotations, more information for you to take a look at, maybe on your own time. This is really cool about Signbank. Remember we were talking about the representations that were really dependent on gloss and how problematic that could be? This really reduces that problem using Signbank and Elon in a way that's interactive, that's connected between the two, because you don't have to depend so much on slang. You can see that here below and how that's represented. Watch the lower the screen on the bottom. You're less dependent on the glossing. See the facial expression, how to annotate that, how to search for different terms. Very cool. Isn't that cool? Really nice resource. Technology is magic. Anyway, I'm going to allow you to look into frequency, which is another factor. Just very briefly, this is from my computer. I don't know why. They have like 1,000 different of these examples on my computer. I have so many, I just collect them. But I can search all of them because of the standard language, the standard way that it's labeled within the system. So I know that this is the top usage because it comes up at the top. That's how that is being represented, for example. I can also take a look at different categories of signs. I know that it's problematic in the way that it's represented here, the terms and variations, but you can see how it populates. Name signs come lower, lexical signs come higher. If there are different events or different type of topics that you're trying to research. This is just really interesting with how you can see really what a long way we've come from trying to collect videos in the 90s. And then trying to get individual researchers, trying to figure out how to represent data in 2008 into the project that now allows us such a robust system and that any user can access. Signbank is ongoing. We have lots of different projects that are using it, over 25 different actors, over 3,300 entries, 170 different registered users. You can see all the variety of users. This is a textual representation. This is ID glossing, video, Signbank, and the annotation with Elon. And all of that together means that our ASL is accessible. And there you have it.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A for all the presenters.
Here's just some more information
Do you want to
for
go
your
to QR?
use if you want to access.
Yeah.
Oh, this is Yale's where the money is. That's why you see that associated with Yale, because they have the funding. They got the grant, so that's why it's getting referenced here. Everybody got this? I can take this down.
Nancy. I know you can smell that pizza over there.
I just have a real,
One second, let me get next to you.
just want to know whether there's some chance. There's, I work in corpus construction, but I do work in historical corpus construction, and there already is a writing system, so that's wonderful. But some of the issues that come up are the same. Normalization and lemmatization and so on and so forth. The one comment I have is there's a guy at the NSF now, Tyler Kendall. Do you know his name?
Tyler Kendall. He's at the, did I just say LSA and then NSF? Okay. He's at the NSF and he is interested in annotation, sociolinguistic variation, and maintaining and curating corpora. So if you don't know him, he might be somebody to get in touch with. And he's from the University of Oregon, but he's at NSF. He's been seconded to the NSF for, I think, last year and this coming year.
Another question?
And which division is he in?
Linguistics, yeah, and he works with Joe Mailing. He's in the
Joe who?
Joe Mailing, M-A-L-I-N-G.
I'm familiar. Okay. Yes.
So I have a question for the talk, one talk ago, not for Curdy and Joseph, which is whether you've thought about, or maybe already done, trying to catch people when they arrive and then follow up with them later.
We have not yet done that. We have to see who's available in order to video them, and then, but that is one thing that we have not yet done. But it's an interesting idea to see who we get and then see if anything changes in their signing. And kind of do a longitudinal, but our project is going to do that right now.
It occurred to me that it was the kind of thing where even if you had, 2 or 3 people that you managed to do that with, that could be a really interesting supplement to the bigger project without doubling how much work there was.
The reason being is we have 2 groups of people that we do social interviewing and then we do the lexical eliciting. With that lexical eliciting, it's interesting to see how they sign. The social linguistic interviews, you can see they show us signs and then it comes up in their interviews later. And so we use a lot of that, whether they're home signs or signs that they've learned at RIT on campus. And so we've kind of been able to compare those 2 things. That's one thing that we have noticed, whether they're using a more standardized or more home signs.
Bias this question. I'm interested in young deaf signers because I am a mother of 2 teenage deaf kids now. And so as I looked at that in terms of regional variation, my kids are regular communicating with deaf children from all over the US, through video, for FaceTime.
Okay.
And currently there are multiple group chats called Hangout. And so there's a bunch of people on the screen at the same time. And a lot of them chat with each other starting at the age of, my kids started when they were like 5th or 6th grade. So I'm wondering, if the next few generations of deaf kids, the geographical regional variations might be lessened compared with, there will be deaf schools, that are around and they will keep things going in terms of variation. But I'm wondering, my kids go to deaf school, but they are also communicating with each other often, obviously. But then the mainstream deaf kids, even if they are, in a large deaf program, are they also interacting with deaf children on FaceTime or any kind of video chat? I'm sure that's going to impact the variation that we have, don't you think? So
It's very possible.
we've never even thought about that as a category yet of social variation analysis. I suspect that we're going to have to start asking that question. How often do you interact with other deaf children on FaceTime? So, because that's going to impact what variation will look like.
You're right, that definitely makes sense. Communication to happen, you have to have a connection in different ways, whether it's in person or virtual. And often, it really does influence how language is used. It does make sense. Another thought is about with deaf schools. I think it depends on the school and what resources they have to have these conversations over technology and trying to invest in that. At deaf schools, they might not have that, or they have less money to be able to support that kind of activity.
and so that there'd be less influence on their languages. That's something to consider.
Anyway, okay, fascinating.
I just wanted to ask something, it goes back maybe to earlier in the day. So dominance reversal, anybody look at whether or not being left-handed or right-handed, is there any difference in the quantity of dominance reversal or the type of dominance reversal?
So we were just talking about thinking that we should start asking about handedness of our participants.
It's always lefties that are.
Okay. I do know, I was talking about this with, I was talking about this with Joe Toscano at Villanova, and he was telling me about the research on how left-handed people have weaker preferences for left-handedness than right people do for right-handedness. And so we were interested in whether degree of like how ambidextrous you are might facilitate how much you reverse your dominance, and then from there you could start connecting up with really interesting questions about like brain lateralization of language, because that's different maybe in left-handed and right-handed people, although he tells me that area of research is a bit of a mess. Because there's just not enough left-handed people to guys like make some big pools. But I do think starting with some questions about whether we see conditioning of dominance reversal by handedness and strength, especially by strength of handedness preference, I think would be really interesting and easy to start doing.
I think everybody might be a little bit hungry. Why don't we go ahead and eat? We can continue to have an opportunity to talk amongst ourselves. Thank you all so much. Thank you very, very much. Very appreciated.